Well, I really am appreciative of being here. I will say right up front, it's a peculiar church, this one to me. And I mean that in two ways. First, I deal a lot with everybody from the poor little Baptist guy who has just a handful of people in a little town to a Pentecostal guy who has thousands. And the one thing that usually happens if I were going to stand up here is that I would be the only guy in the room who has any belief in the doctrines of grace. So I would try to explain life, and the doctrines of grace are in that life to me. So that was normally what I'm looking at when I look out there, where I realize I'm going to have to lay a foundation and build on it. What's odd about this group is, and I said it to somebody today, the first 7 or 8 guys I met here were all better equipped to pastor a church than the last 7 pastors I've met. Now, why God is doing that here has puzzled me since I came the first time. And Jeff, I like Jeff right off, but when we broke into groups and he asked for, I think it was Exodus 2, and he wanted how many, ironies, and everybody had them. I didn't even have to pitch in. I knew I was in a different group than I normally am, because we're not used to, even in Chicago, we would have to explain irony for a little while before we could find it. So I thought, well, why would I be here then? Because certainly sovereignty, I was saying to Charles, if you understand sovereignty and providence, you know one thing. You have to see the world through those glasses. If you do, sometimes you're the only guy in the room who actually sees the world as it is. That's true. It's a privilege to be able to see it like that. And I can't see it any other way. So if I meet Marie, I want to know why. You know, what God's doing with her. Why would I be the one? Because I spend a lot of my time, as I said to Marie, in pubs or Starbucks and those things, and God seems to send people all the time. God always encourages those things, but I always feel like I'm bringing light to the darkness. I want to know how they think about the world, because I was them forever. But also, I want to be that guy who says, this is not working so well, life. And I want you to understand that at the back of all of those things, you learn to talk to people, whether they're unbelievers or missionaries, are a particular burden on my heart sometimes, because you send missionaries off and they're afraid to tell you they don't know everything, and nobody really continues to educate them. And you'll find I'm dead set against any kind of decisionalism in the present form as we normally see it. So now you send a missionary out there and you tell him to win souls, and then you don't give him any ammo on how he should really deal with these people. I'm thinking that maybe that's what this calling of this particular church will be from me. You could probably find people here who will certainly do a better job with the doctrines of grace. My wife gets mad when I say that, but I'm sure you can do it better than I can. Now, what I will give you is that they're always going to be in the context of dealing with people, because that's my context. The last thing, I once planted a church, and we grew a church where we managed to teach you everything you ever needed to know. We had a lot of guys who could talk to you about double predestination until they couldn't go to sleep at night. And one in particular, I still see him when I go downstate. God makes him come by and see me, because it just breaks my heart to think I did that to him, and he's still in it. I never got him out of there where he could actually talk to somebody about anything reasonable or useful, and it's my fault. So I don't intend to duplicate that in my time here. But I want you to understand that I'm going to start with sovereignty. And the reason is on the doctrines of grace. And the reason is, in real life, when you deal with people who don't understand these doctrines already, you can eventually persuade them that God sends the rain and that God had something to do with the car running over their foot. But they'll always hold out on salvation. And I want to make sure that we're so steeped in it, that I am, that we don't make that mistake when we talk to people. Now, that means that I'm probably going to tell you how I think through my own life a lot, because it's the guy you know best. my own mistakes have been some of my best instructors. And I will, along the way, you'll hear me say it. In fact, you'll wonder if I ever learned anything without doing it badly first. Most of you are probably like that too, really. But you have to learn that sometimes that opens the door for you. It not only humbles you, but it opens the door when people find out you're not Moses. You know what I mean? I used to speak from the mountaintop to people, and they were very impressed, but I never influenced them. And I decided there was a big difference. Maybe this church will be like that, where you might not be able to impress everybody, but certainly wouldn't it be wonderful if God found a way for you to spread your influence a lot further even than whatever it is. And I have the advantage of not knowing how far it is. I'm saying all that because it may seem like I'm doing things in an unorthodox manner sometimes, but if you will hang in there, I will get you through the doctrines of grace. And I hope I will not have done you any harm. Okay? I prayed today that God would keep me from doing anything really crazy or bizarre. I love Charles, and I don't want you to be mad at him that he had me come here. It is really a great friend of mine. It was actually God sent him to me. He was an old man when I met him, and he had a big influence on me. And his name was Dr. John Gerstner. Now, some of you folks would know who he is probably. Not very many places would. And Dr. Gerstner was a guy who taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary for 50 years or something. And I met him through a book on Jonathan Edwards. And when I called him, I realized he was a guy who was straightforward and kind of met my need. I was a Christian, but I was, as he said to me one time, Mr. Moore, you hold all the heresies of the last 500 years simultaneously. He actually said that to me, and I said to him, well, you know, the last time I saw you, you were kind of looking old and peaked. Let's straighten them out. I wasn't really interested in all that commentary. So I bought him a fax machine, and I think it must have been in the early 80s. Cost me $3,300 I didn't have at the time. It was so he got it and he called me and he said, Mr. Moore, they told me you gave me a Cadillac. And I said, yeah, because here's what I want to do. When I want an answer, I don't want some letter. I want to fax you the thing and I want you to send it back to me tomorrow morning. You know what I mean? Because I wasn't sleeping much in those days. And he laughed and he did. And then he taught me a thing where he would answer your questions by asking a question. And that's a very good way when you deal with people once you understand it, because you don't get to do a scripted thing. You understand? You can't just pour out what you say, your little 4 paragraphs. You have to actually listen and relax and respond and be normal, which unfortunately is missing a lot in Christianity as I see it when I move around. But he was very helpful to me, and he did go home. And he never once asked me what I did. He came and spoke for us. Never once said anything. I probably didn't tell him that, but I meant to. The only thing he did when he came to speak, and he was very old at the time, he said, now, Mr. Moore, I only have 2 requests. And one is that you sit next to me so that I can hear their questions. I can't hear them. He couldn't hear them. When I would call him every Monday night, we'd have a group that would call him. And he had a phone that amplified it. And he would get in this room and he'd answer questions and never once ask who you were, and I'm sure we were some of the oddest group of people and uneducated people, but he had great patience, and then he would say, and I always want to be the last one to leave the room. He was in his 80s, but he said, if Andy wants to ask questions all night, I want to be there. Now, that's sort of where I learned that idea that, I'm staying right out here. I mean it when I say, if you just call me or email me, I'm available all the time. I'm actually here just to serve you. Whatever it is I know or have, I want to share with you. And a lot of times it takes a personal thing. Okay? So just call me. Otherwise, I will be bothering the Baptist and the Methodist and everybody else in the neighborhood, because that's what I believe in doing. And I will, and that's one of the things I think you'll probably end up thinking is a good idea. If you have the knowledge of these things, I want you to think about your influence to those poor people who don't have it. And lots of times they're brothers in Christ who are just misinformed. And they need friends. And whenever I find this many people, I just either think it's for that purpose, or maybe God's just going to explode the church and make you guys form 30 churches or something. I've never seen a group where everybody's so knowledgeable. It still is. You'll hear me say it over and over only because it seems odd to me. Now, I took this picture on the front page. This is the Valley of the Dry Bones. And the reason is real simple. Can these bones live? That struck me years ago that's really what I was asking every time you got up and talked to people. Can these bones live? It took God's power to make those bones live, and it certainly, all you're going to hear from me is that it takes the same kind of sovereign power to save us. You know, I had this thing I was thinking, the pastor's right, I'm sort of fixated sometimes on Puritans because some of the greatest minds that ever lived, I think, were Puritan minds, because they were pastoral people who actually understood what they believed. They had that beautiful combination, and that's what I admire. And so you'll see that sometimes. I said to somebody today, you know, the last time I talked to an evangelical free pastor, he said to me, Mr. Moore, you have the lowest view of mankind of anybody I've ever met. And I said to him, I got it from Moses. You know, it's Genesis 6:5. Isn't that right? Moses said that, you know, this kind of God looked and saw that the thoughts and intents of our heart were continually evil. Now, if you can tell me how I'm supposed to think very highly of us, in the face of that, I'll listen to you. Because then I have to deal with Jeremiah, right? And I have to hear him say, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. But I search the heart, the Lord says. You see, I mean, every time I look, and then I get to Romans 3 and I see Paul saying, no one's good, no, not one, no one seeks after God. And if you want to tell me how I'm supposed to understand human beings outside of that context, you'll have to school me, because that looks to me like where it is. Plus, I don't have to go on, do I, to John 6 or some of those things that we'll deal with as we go through here. So he's right. I have a very low view of man's ability. I have a very high view of man. Why? He's significant. What you do and who you are, whether you're the bartender over at Spasso's or whether you're sitting in here, you're made in the image of God to me, and I'm interested in what God's doing with you. And the truth of the matter is, I probably think that your life is more important than you do. I'm probably more interested in what God might do through you than you are. Sometimes we slide into these things where we don't, we don't know where God's leading us. Well, I want to know where God's leading you. Because if I can do three things for you, and I try to remember this for myself first. One is to educate. The other is to encourage. And then the last thing I can do for you is to exhort you. And I'm 60 years old last month. To think that I get to do these things now before I die is a wonder to me. And I want your life to be a wonder to you. And I want you to understand how important it is that you study, that you actually pray. Do you ever pray without praying? You ever do that where you don't have prayerful prayer? You know what I mean? Certainly I do it. I've done it a lot, in my life. But I'm trying to get away from it 100% of the time right now, because I like the idea that I'm near death. Now, I know in churches, a lawyer sent me a letter not long ago saying, I know you're happy with Lois. I wish you wouldn't talk about death all the time. Listen, I still think death is a reward. I know that sounds odd in this day and age, but I need to see it like that. I've never been particularly good at life, and I told the pastor tonight, when I said I was a carny, I was actually exaggerating my status most of my life. That's an upgrade for a guy like me, and I'll tell you about that because I just want you to understand everything I think through may not be right. I don't mean doctrinally. What I mean is my approach to life. You may say, well, some of this I'd like to listen to, and some of it I want to discard. That's fine. But I'm just going to tell you from my heart how I view Reformed people, and hopefully I'll be able to find out by the time I leave here what it is I should encourage you about, not only individually but as a church. Surely God doesn't want you to come here and camp around a bunch of embers and just keep each other warm forever. And I don't know that that happens. I'm not trying to say I'm proposing or I know any of these things. I'm just saying to you, I'm excited because every time I hear people answer or ask a really good question, I'm not used to that. So there must be a purpose in what God's doing with this group. So I'm grateful to have it. Now, the one thing you're going to hear over and over in this course, of course, is the tulip. And that's going to be, now the one thing that I know that my friend Thomas Watson said was, there are many physicians that can cure the sick, but only Christ can cure the dead. And that was you and me, isn't it? Huh? I mean, weren't you dead in sin and trespasses? I mean, if you weren't, we need to have a little longer talk. We'll have to go out for coffee. But if you'll turn the page, I'm going to come to the second page, which is actually it says page 1. It's what we're trying to do here. And I'm going to breeze by with just a couple of thoughts here. And that is, the testing will be different. And it will either be a joy to you or a problem. And that is, I want to give you some real conversations that I have with people where, as I said to Mary, where somebody will say something like, I don't care what you say, I don't hate the law, but I don't think it's right for God to arbitrarily send some people to hell. Now that's real conversation. See, they're supposed to do like this. You say what you want, and then they answer perfectly back, and then right? That's how we practice it in Sunday school, for goodness sake. Well, the problem is, in the real world, it doesn't work that way. And here's question number 39. Now, by next week, I will give you all the possible questions for the test. What a friendly guy I am. Here's why. If there's 58, 20 of them might show up on the final. If you call me, I'll take you out and help you answer every one of them. Because I'm more interested in equipping you than figuring out if you passed the course with an A. Okay? But it might be uncomfortable for good students. You know why? Good students like to know that they know before they have to, they know the answer, right? You know the answer. I can get an A. I was that kind of a student. But let me give you an example. I happen to just remember number 39, which is kind of a convoluted one. Okay, Bill, let's suppose that Farmer Jones owns a pond. 3 drunken teenagers with whiskey in the car drive down the embankment, go into the pond, right, are fighting for their lives, and you're telling me Farmer Jones comes down the embankment with 3 life preservers and throws 1. Is that justice, Bill? If it is, that's not the kind of God I want to serve. Now, I'm going to ask you to answer that question. See, because that's a real life conversation. Now, you'd like to tell him that that's not fair. You'd like to tell him that you'd like to phrase it your own way. I'm telling you what people say to you. And when you're talking to a Church of Christ pastor or somebody like that, you'll get some things that are difficult. Now, if you answered that question 25 different ways, you might all be right. Right in this sense. I want you to try it. I don't care if it sounds funny to you. You try it. At the end of the questions, I'll know whether or not you got what total depravity was, what unconditional election was, what limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints are. You know why? The questions make you answer that. But where I may be able to help you is I might be able to help you to decide, well, 7 of those questions are really about the fairness. How do I address fairness in this situation? Now, as I said, by next week, if I get a chance at the end, I'll give you a couple of them now. But I don't want you to worry about it, because my emphasis will be on whether or not Jeff gets it. And he'll let me know in his answer. And his answer, frankly, may be better than mine. I came here really to learn from you. I don't know if that makes sense to you. But I'm going to go out again in February, and God will send all kinds of people across my path, and anything I can learn from you will be invaluable to me. Because sometimes they say things that I don't know what to do with. Now, most of the time, God's given me enough experience, I can deal with a lot of things. But Lois will tell you, I was in Copper Mill, Tennessee, passing my time, and there's always, God sends these people, and the woman took her wig off, and she had cancer and had to put a nose on the back of her head, and she was going, I guess, trick-or-treating. Then I got in a conversation with them. Turned out they invited me to their church, which was she said it was run by a Jewish convert, but it was a sweat lodge. Well, you know, I realized I was going to have trouble starting down this. Lois said, I never saw you hesitate like that. And I said, well, I didn't even know what doctrine to approach with that, because I was afraid to ask them. They were, one guy was a full-blooded Cherokee, and she looked like she was within really, she was really cancerous. And I felt bad. But I'm saying that because I want you to know those are the conversations you'll get if you go out and spread your influence around. And isn't that why God gives you this ability? If he gives you a fine mind, aren't you going to use it for him? Aren't they still lost? Aren't they still perishing? Why should it be somebody else but you or me? Now, we'll get a chance to interact, and we'll get it in, you'll see all of these things over time. Now, at first I'm going to have to run through these, because I'm going to put them in that context of evangelism always, and I want you to get that. And I'm going to give you Dr. Gerstner's little primer on evangelism, which was this. That's supposed to be an S. 5 kinds of evangelism. This is worth kind of seeing if he's right. The first one was silence. Second one is sacraments. The third one, Lois, do you remember? I'm just kidding. No, it's surrender. The next one is shrug. And this one, I'm going to leave. Now, of these, which one do you think is the typical Baptist approach today in the United States? Do they use silence, sacraments, surrender, or shrug? Take a stab. Well, sometimes silence. If any Arminian is there, what are they really asking you to do? Surrender, right? That's surrender. Silence is, you get it in every church really, where people say, well, I'm just going to win them over by being chaste. And it certainly has a place to do that. But silence lots of times is because we don't know what to do. Or maybe in some cases we don't care. Sacraments, my friend Jimmy from Chicago should be here Wednesday. He's a Greek Orthodox. When I said to him, well, he said, what am I trusting in? And I said, in that baptism. And he said, oh. I said, yeah, that's the right approach. Oh, it's about right. He said, I mean, when I was a kid. I said, yeah. He said, I don't feel comfortable with that one. I said, good. But that's true, isn't it? And how do they get converts in this group? They have babies. Okay? Now, which one do you think is the typical Reformed church way of doing evangelism, according to Dr. Gerstner? The shrug. Now, that's not our history, is it, folks? We're the church of the Horatio Bonars and, the Spurgeons and the Bunyans. right? If you read any of those kinds of people's sermons, Whitfield, you won't find them shrugging. But we shrug a lot these days. Now, I have the advantage. I said, this church may not. I don't know that. But you'll find that a lot of Reformed churches shrug. Now, I'll let you decide what that final S should be when we get through this. Mary in particular will have to. I kind of pick on Mary because it's just easy. She's up front, and I heard something about her today that made me think about it. Now, when we come to the goals, here's the thing I'm looking for, and I want you to understand it. Students should develop a deeper sense of awe. When you're all alone, I don't mind the corporate awe, but when you're all alone and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, I want you to be so in awe of the God that you're thinking about. Because I want that for Bill Moore. That's what I want, really, when you're all alone and you're stealing away. I want you to feel. There was a poem by a girl from St. Louis who lived in the 30s. Her name was Sarah Teasdale that I like. She said, I am my beloved's and he is mine. Seal with a seal and say forevermore. Think you I could let a beggar enter where a king had stood before. And I think that way about Christ sometimes. Andy, aren't we his groomsmen? I mean, he is everything. And one day, this world's going to end and we're all going to see the eternal groom. And it's going to be a wonderful day. Isn't that what we live for? Surely we don't live just to escape hell, although it's part of the blessing. The idea is we want to see him and love him. Well, I want to give you a sense of where you came from enough to where it affects your view of him. And especially the next one, that the student should develop a deeper affection for the lost and a need for God's grace and evangelism. If we're right, if they're as depraved as we're going to say they are, if they really are as depraved as Moses said, if they're really as dead as Paul believed, it shouldn't be the death of evangelism. It should be the birth of evangelism, because we would evangelize knowing that we better have God on our side. As Watson said, only Christ can raise the dead. Okay? Here are those dead ones. So we're going to talk about it. Everything will be like that in the context of evangelism, whether it's limited atonement or something else. And you'll have to decide if it spurs you on to care about them, or maybe you already have a great passion for them. I just know that I've gone through periods of my life where I thought I did and didn't, if you know what I mean. You can tell because a man's philosophy is worked out in his actions. And if you don't pray for them, and if you don't beg God for the life for them, when you know they can't help themselves, well, maybe you are like me. Maybe you need to think through these things and ask God to change your heart and warm it up a little bit. They are your brothers and sisters because you are just like them. Today, the pastor used Romans 4:5. God justifies whom? The ungodly. That's the one thing I know about everybody sitting out here. Isn't that true? You all began there. You were ungodly. You were all dead. You were deaf. You were blind. And you didn't even know it. Isn't that right, Jim? You didn't even know it. And so then you petition God for grace. No. No. He sovereignly, to work out his purpose, right? He sovereignly intervened when you couldn't help yourself. Now that's the story, and you'll see here in a minute how the effect it had on me. Now, there's a chance here that we're going to forget, I will, to remind you that somebody a lot smarter than I am once said, I don't have use for a church that's not a church militant. Now, he meant something really aggressive. What I mean by that is this is supposed to be the church militant here on earth. The church triumphant is that great cloud of witnesses, isn't that right? They're there now, aren't they? I mean, what separates us from them? I see if I go to sleep tonight and wake up in the morning in heaven, I'll be part of the church triumphant. It won't make any difference. Now, I say this because I know I liked Jeff right off, and this is Josh, right? Yeah. Your son. And I thought about this afternoon, and you've got to understand, I don't even know when I say the reason I'm here, you may be very helpful to me. It would be worth it to me. Would it be worth it to you if you lived the rest of your life and spoke one sentence that was effective with Josh? One sentence. It would be to me, you see, because I don't really know. I spent most of my life doing things that were unproductive. And now, these last few years, God is going to give me the opportunity to do something productive for him. If that's just that Josh, he might be the next Martin Luther. Is that enough for you? Or do you have some other kind of goals? It's bad to have those goals handy. You have something, God always kind of tricks you with those goals, doesn't he? So I want you to think about that, because maybe you'll say the right thing to me that'll make a difference to a guy in Omaha or a guy in Wilmington, North Carolina, or maybe my son. I have a son who's 33, unconverted, and I love him dearly. But I liked it when I had decisionalism in my pocket, because I converted him when he was young. I converted every member of my family and extended family. And when I realized I hadn't converted them except to be my converts, I went back and tried to unconvert them. And I'll tell you, nobody, Atlas couldn't do that. You go back and try to get them and tell them I lied to you. I misrepresented it. It isn't just saying this prayer with me and then leading your life the way you want. They say, don't tell me that. I love Jesus. Only now people are dying all around me who I spoke to like that, and I wouldn't make that mistake now that I made then. Okay? In the next page, which is page 3, you'll see that I'm going to deal with sovereignty first. Tonight I will deal with a guy who's one of my favorites in the Scripture. His name's Jephthah. How many know Jephthah? It'd be just like this church to have people know Jephthah. Jephthah's usually well known because he made an infamous vow. But he's good for me for a different reason, which I'll explain to you in a minute. You'll see that I'm going to deal with, on week 4, total depravity and free will, which is a little different. I'll let that old German Martin Luther teach you then, as you taught me. But we'll go through these things, and hopefully I won't make it theoretical. I hope it'll be worshipful, because it means a lot to me, these things. They're dear to my heart when I'm all alone, and I want them to be dear to you. If you go to class 1 over there, who are you? Well, I'm a director of a thing called Ezra Ministries. It's based on Ezra 7:10, which is that Ezra studied these things to apply them to his own life and make disciples. It's based in Illinois, and it's a nice little group of people who let me do these things and believe in it. But we put on a weekly TV show, the second one there, you'll see it, host of a small TV show, plain talk about life in the Bible. And I try to follow along with that idea that Spurgeon once said, where a man at the beginning of a road put a pump down and hung a tin can on it, and he learned later that somebody had come along and been critical of that pump. And he asked a question that I would ask, which is, did any thirsty people drink from it? Understand, I want to be plain with you. It doesn't matter if the pump isn't fancy. It doesn't matter if the pump doesn't even have a handle. Can you get water from it? It just may be that the plainer you speak to people, the more effective you'll be. Because the average Baptist pastor that I see, if I use too many big words, he just comes away thinking I'm a very smart guy. I don't think that is what I want. One time I think I did want that. Now I don't want that. I want to help him. I want to be his brother. If I know something that will help him down that road, I need to learn to say it as plainly, as simply as I can. And if that means I have to come up with examples, Ron, that are in his neighborhood, if he's a rural guy, maybe I need to work a little harder at it, because it's my job in life to help him to deal with his congregation. It's your job. Aren't those brothers and sisters? in those Baptist congregations of 13 in some little town on Route 4, aren't they your brothers and sisters? They're his sheep. You see, and sometimes they haven't had the privilege that you have to be around a Sunday school class where somebody would help you to straighten out bad thinking. A little of life's background. Well, Jephthah, you'll see why he was important to me. I don't want to bore you with it. It was just simple. Twain once said, I never let my schooling get in the way of my education. That was my life. I was, as I say to my wife, I was a good burglar, a bad armed robber, and I was born to be a bookmaker. So when I was young, I left school so that I could burglarize in the evenings and gamble during the day. I considered myself a devout atheist in those days. I say I tried armed robbery. I just really never wanted to shoot anybody, so I gave that up because it's the only, if you're not willing, you shouldn't be doing that particular line of work. Now, it took me, therefore, I had trouble. You can imagine that I might have had trouble with schooling. I did. They finally let me out by working. They gave me credit for working at a pool hall a year after I should have, and then I could already drive for about 5 years, so they gave me a quarter of a credit to get me through there. But I was a violent person in those days, and violent enough I never really got to have that homeroom experience. I was always out of the office. I missed 106 days the one day of 1 year of high school. They asked me to come. So they started letting me go 2 hours a day because I was an angry, violent person. And I had a dream of living till 25 and dying. And so I did all manner of wicked things as fast as I could, and I sleep very little. So I managed to rack up a lot of pitiful things. And sometimes it almost sounds like I'm saying something positive. I'm not. When I'm all alone, I can't, I'm ashamed of it, but it's who I am. And did God shape me through those things? I promise He did. The other day, a friend of mine from that time, I saw his obituary. It said, Raleigh Laverne Elsner, age 60, died at St. John's Hospice. That's it. Raleigh Laverne Elsner, age 60, died at St. John's Hospice. Now, Raleigh was a burglar. Raleigh was on trial once for shooting a man, tying him up with his hands behind his back and shooting him through the thighs till he bled to death. Part of a very famous murder case. Somebody told me that in the last 6 months of his life he became a Christian. God does things that are sort of strange sometimes. I hope that report is true. But I'm saying to you, that should have been my obituary. Useless, worthless, at 25. And at that point I decided that I needed to kill myself because it looked like I was going to get to 25 and I didn't have a plan. It's true. And God, does He govern the lives of unbelievers? Well, absolutely. We forget to tell Him that sometimes. And He was governing this life of a supposed atheist. And I decided to kill myself, but for 6 months I never left my apartment. I tried to write the suicide note that wouldn't make my mother feel guilty. She was the one person I actually cared about. And I couldn't do that, and God repaid me for that 6 months by letting me win more money than I ever made in my whole stinking life. I had money sticking out of every light fixture, it's true. My apartment wasn't big enough to hold the money I had, and I never left. I just sent cabs for food. Now you think that worthless person, God would let him just die and be done. He didn't. The whole time, He intended to bring me to the light. So I was such a vicious person about things in those days that when I finally got married, and it wasn't Lois, I got married. I couldn't have been a ranker person. And I walked out to the end of my driveway in August of 1978, and I raised my fist to the heavens. And I'd had a pastor doing a Bible study at my house. I allowed him to do it without me there. And he had a hairpiece that was always at about 3/4 mast, which bothered me a lot, still does. But he he had told me I was going to hell, and that people, he quoted Romans 3 to me, about every mouth shall be stopped. And I walked the end of the driveway, and I stuck my fist up to heaven and my middle finger, and I threatened God. And I said, if you exist, what you better probably do is to go ahead and kill me now, because I will not be quaking when that day comes. Now, can you imagine such moronic behavior? Now, how did God repay that? Within 6 months, I was converted. Now, does God do that? Sounds hard to do, but do you think it's any harder for him to convert Marie or Mary? Did it take one bit less power for John? John seems like a really wonderful guy sitting back there. He has such a gentleness about him. Or Charles? They may not have done all of those things, but you know, in the way of eternal justice, could you slip a piece of paper between that moron that I am and Charles? Charles was dead. Charles might not have all of the sins on his record, outward sins that I did, but I promise you, Charles was on his way to hell. And that's why when we get here, this next little part, you'll see a little life background. Well, really, and I'll just tell you how it was. A couple of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, once I owned a mortgage company. I sold it in 1998. Where I come from, as a business person, I'm actually kind of well known. So I sold the mortgage company. I thought it was all behind me. One day I got a call from an attorney saying, well, the guys who bought your mortgage company have been doing things illegally. And they're saying that they gave you money behind the building, and you need to come talk to me. So I talked to him, and he said, here's how it works. These guys are going to testify to this, and they're going to call you before the grand jury, and you're going to go to prison for 5 years. Well, it bothered me only because most of my life I've been guilty, and I never was afraid of prison because I deserved it. This was the one time I didn't. And honestly, my wife will tell you, maybe I just had gotten older, but here I was feeling pretty good about myself, and all of a sudden, the guy's telling me, you're going to go to prison. And I said, but I'm not guilty. I thought that was enough. And he said, no, it doesn't matter. They know you, and they need somebody. These guys were going to advance their careers in his estimation doing this. Now, God miraculously got me out of that. And sometime if I get your loan, I'll tell you how. But the point was, my wife, who's a darling person, said to me, well, you'll make a great prisoner. She really was convinced. If you teach people about sovereignty, the problem you have is some of them take it to heart. And I was trying to say to her, I'm your husband. And she said, nobody's better equipped to go to jail than you. You're not afraid of these things, and you get along with these guys. And I'd done a lot of prison ministry things. So I said, well, okay. And so I saw she wasn't going to leave me. Well, I was really grateful, because as you get to know her, you'll realize that I couldn't do without this woman. I love her so dearly. And she said, well, I said, what am I going to do? And she said, well, you should write a book. I said, well, I've never done that. And she said, well, no, but all you can do is read and write. And she was correct about that. That's all I have ever really been able to do. When I was a burglar, I had a full set of Shakespeare's works in my back seat. Does that make any sense? I wouldn't go to school, but I wanted to be a Shakespearean student. That's crazy. But now, in the last couple of years, it's become apparent God actually got me out of it, but it changed my life. Now, is that sovereignty? Yes. I didn't finish my life as a businessman storing up a lot more money. I'm going to finish my life in service, hopefully, to people like you, or to the girl at Starbucks, or whatever. So I wrote a little book. I tried, and part of it's still under review here. I waited now till I got through, so you guys taught me a few things I could add to it. It's called A Strange Thing Happened on My Way to Hell. But that's your story, isn't it? Is that Eileen's story? A strange thing happened on her way to hell. It did, didn't it? I mean, she was on her way to hell here. When we get through with the T, you'll know Eileen was on her way to hell. And the one thing I'm going to tell you is it's going to be unconditional. It's not going to be for anything he saw in Eileen. If you can tell me how that's not the Bible doctrine, I'll listen to you then, but I'm going to be probably a bear to deal with, because we all have that testimony. My story is your story. It just has different names to the people. Yours will be named Paula or Randy. You know, and mine will be Boston Shorty and Cornbread Red and guys with funny names. But we're all of the same ilk. Don't mistake it. So I tried that, and it turned out I could do it. I wasn't sure I could. Now, I'm not telling you about the quality of it. I'm just the fact that I could actually put a pen to paper and do something was surprising to me. So I dealt with a bartender in Winnetka. She ran a pub down there. It was the most wonderful bartender in the world, as far as I could see. Her name's Marie. And she asked me questions. She had cancer and some other problems, and people had real-life questions. And I realized I needed to be able to deal with these things when she would wait on me and go back and wait on Ron or go down the road. And that she wasn't going to give me an hour to explain everything in the same way. So I learned to say things in a different fashion. And it was good for me. I realized I'd been doing it somewhat all my life, but I realized she was willing to talk about these things in the pub if I could talk about life. And the two things that you'll see that I'll say to you that they want to know, and everybody really wants to know this, it's real simple. There are two things. They want to know about their pain. If you can figure out how to deal with pain, and what better way than to talk about sovereignty? And the other one is they all want to be significant. I might misspell this now. You'll have to forgive me. And as I said to you earlier, I think they're significant. They don't. They're searching for it, and they already have it, in my mind. You see, when I see that bartender, I know God's governing her life. He's keeping her breathing tonight, isn't he? He's feeding her. If you start asking people how they met their husband, most of them will believe in some form of sovereignty. But I never asked them that. You see, I wanted to explain it as Moses would have explained it to them, sitting there, and they didn't listen to me. So I've learned to try to do that. That's what this book is about. You'll read one little section of it, A Bartender's Guide to Providence, how the world really works. As I said in the beginning, it's the powder and the clay, and only you guys understand it. Isn't that true? Next one, Wallowing in the World, A Peak at Earthly Mindedness. Heaven forbid, I said to them, the first Bible when I converted, God sent me to some bunch of crazy charismatic people, and I had a Bible. I underlined every Bible verse that had to do with money in green. I still have that Bible because it humbles me. Understand what a moron I was? Now, why? Well, because now when I run into that guy, and those guys are out there, I'm sympathetic to that pastor who's still talking about how heaven is on earth. I understand how he got to be so stupid. I was that stupid. You know, now if God in His grace removed me from that, I'm grateful, but I don't want to forget my roots. Those guys need help, and they have real sheep in those congregations. And maybe we can help them. So I tried. That was my effort. I won't bore you with the rest of them, except to say the next couple are children's books. The music CD. My wife volunteered me in the British Virgin Islands to write lyrics, although I've never done any such a thing. I can't sing, and I don't know a musical instrument. So I tried, because I do know 16th and 17th century poetry, basically, and I don't know anything else. So I tried, and believe it or not, the guy makes it into music. Now, we laughed coming out here because the first part of them are all the Psalms about, oh Lord, the lions are after me, you know. You see this, your hand is heavy on me, because I was going through that personal thing. Now they've turned out to be a little bit more about Christ in that wedding day and different things. I'll put a couple of them in here because when you deal with people, whether I deal with you or you deal with me, one component that is certainly there always is emotion. And some people find lyrics or poetry or a single phrase to be emotional and more memorable and moving. And all I'm really wanting to do is to affect them. Isn't that what you want? Whatever it takes to affect people so they turn their eyes away from themselves and to God. In that last section, is Charles's fault I'm here? Yeah, it is. It's sovereignty, and Charles was an answer to my prayer because I was convinced, Andy, that God, my sole purpose was to go and never enjoy one service. I told somebody today, the last evangelical free one I went to, people were blowing kazoos and throwing confetti at a baptismal service. I thought sure God would bury me in that building, and my boy would think I went crazy at the last moment. And I told Lois, I was standing there. They did that, and it's the saddest thing you've ever seen. But that's, you know what? There are some of his sheep in that church, and you try to wrestle for their souls because that guy's not helping them. So we're going to take a 5-minute break here, always at this time where Matt changes this. In 2 seconds, I'll say it when Matt doesn't, when he's changing it. I want to push you towards this idea that we need to admit we're wrong about some things. Now, do you find it easy to admit you're wrong? I never have. And finally, I saw a thing. John Maynard Keynes, who was a great economist, said, a guy asked him about, he proved him wrong one time, and he said, Mr. Keynes, are you willing to admit you're wrong? And he said to him, sir, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? I realize that's what I'm asking everybody that I deal with to do, isn't it? They have a set of opinions, and the facts changed. If I change the facts and show them what the situation is in sovereignty, I'm asking them to change their mind. I know it's hard. I was prideful, still am. And I have the problems with that. And Alexander Pope, who I love dearly, said, a man should never be ashamed to admit he's wrong. You know why? It's another way, it's just a way of saying I'm wiser today than I was yesterday. Okay? Now I'm going to ask you to do that somewhere in here, is to change your mind about some things. And I'm hoping that those kinds of quotes will stick with you somewhat as I say them, because they come in handy when you deal with people. I know I've rattled on, and I'm going to have to get to Jephthah here in a second. But I wanted to lay the foundation for this because I want you to understand that this sovereignty is going to be the context of all of these lessons. Okay? So please take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back. Thanks. If you'll hang in there with me through this course, I'll explain to you at the end again why I felt it was necessary to exhort you on these things the first night. But it's because I believe that Jim's been shaped a certain way by God for a certain service. And I want Jim to get that. The doctrinal part is the simplest part to me. The hardest part is getting Jim to see it so that he'll step outside and do more and risk more than he's ever risked. Remember what Bonhoeffer said, when God calls a man, he tells him, come and die. See, we're called to set our affections on things above, not on things of this world. Because I have trouble with that, you probably do too. But I know that that's true. We have to set our affections on things above. I'm sorry, Eileen, raise that hand back there. Not on things of the earth. Well, all of those things mean something, and we have to help one another to realize that we need to run through this life as hard and as sacrificially as is possible. Understand? God might be asking you to sacrifice more now than you ever have. But let me ask you, in 100 years, any of you going to be alive? In 100 years, don't you want that last section of your life to have been the hardest, most determined section of your life that you ever gave everything away for, that you ever gave up sleep for? 100 years, a mere 100 years. In my case, maybe, naturally speaking, maybe in 10 years, I will be sitting, listening to Peter tell me about when he spoke in Acts 2. I really don't want to be ashamed of how I finished. I can't help what I've done to this point. You have to decide if that's true for you too, or if everything I'm saying is just so much malarkey. I hope it isn't. Now I'm going to get through this real quick to the next. The chains, skeletons, and madness. It's real simple. Chains to me, when I go into a Starbucks, or if I go into a restaurant tonight, when I see the waiter or the waitress, I hear the chains. I see the chains that they're bound up in. They're captives to me. And I want to be the axe that God uses to emancipate them. But they don't want to be emancipated. They don't care. They love their darkness. Luther called it the disordered chaos of darkness. And if you listen to their conversations, you'll figure out that's exactly what it was that you just heard. Craziness. Yet, I was that person sitting in there. How do you know that that person isn't somebody God intends to convert? Secondly, don't you feel sorry for that guy? I look at him and I try to see across their chain. Spurgeon used to say, on every chain in hell is written forevermore. Now I'm going to tell you, when I believed in decisionalism, I converted everybody that you can imagine. And God tried to show me plainly, any moron would have learned. One day, this is true, I was collecting bad debts for a company. I decided to take the day off and see if I could convert people. Well, I set out, and here's what happened. I was nervous. I walked up to the first, I meant well. I walked up to the first house, and there's a lady sitting on the porch, and she's got no hair on her head and a Bible in her lap. And I said to her, ma'am, if you died today, would you know you'd go to heaven? And she said to me, well, I don't know, but I've been trying to find this part about being born again in the Bible. Any chance you could help me with that? I've got terminal cancer. Well, I'm going to tell you that I went to the next house, and a woman started crying when I got to the front door. I went to the third house. It had a motorcycle couple out in front making out. I decided to speak to him. And I said, look, if you died today, because I only knew this little formula, you follow me? And she starts crying. I went down that street, it's a true story, maybe 6 or 7 houses, and in every case, I mean, the Holy Spirit was so present, it was unbelievable, and I had my little pitch. Now, what conclusion should I have drawn from that? God's sovereign. How could a moron with one little 4-sentence pitch see all these people crying? What conclusion do you think I drew? I must be some sort of special kind of evangelist, for goodness sake. Honest to goodness, I never seen such stupidity. But that would be the kind of thing that I would do over and over for a period of years until God saw that I would be sympathetic enough when I see those morons today doing the same thing. And in spite of their stupidity, God converts sometimes, doesn't he? In spite of, not because of. As long as you understand what decisionalism leads to, at least it did to me, was notches on my Bible and a lot of impersonal Christianity. And that's why you'll see, there's a little lyric here, if you turn a couple of pages, that I wrote, because I try to remind myself of these things. Don't I care enough to weep? And this is just, when you get down to, the chains go unseen by others' eyes, but flash like golden bracelets in mine. Folks boast of knowledge and freedom. I wince because they're senseless and blind. Why don't my eyes brim with tears? How am I able to sleep? Why won't my cold heart break? Don't I care enough to weep for these people? How is it that I could know that they're in chains? How is it that I could know that they're deaf and blind and dead in sin? And every moment, when I see them, when I see this girl tonight over there at this restaurant, I'll know that she's a moment. She's on the end of the plank. She's a moment away from her eternal destiny. And she doesn't know it, and I do. She doesn't care for her own soul. The question is, will I? Couldn't I cry out to God? Break this girl's heart. If it can be me, fine. If it can be Jeff, fine. Surely the one thing I don't want is to be cold to that woman, and yet I've spent a great deal of my life, and still do, being cold to that woman. What's wrong? There's something wrong with that. When I know, I've only loved one man in my life. His name was Mike Brown. Mike lived and had more gamble in him than any man I ever met. When I converted, I called him and said, I cheated you one time out of a few $100s. I tried to repay everybody I cheated when I converted, and I ran out of money. True story. I drove around. I ran out of money. So I gave my OUs. So eventually I was able to pay it. Now, I said to him, you don't have a single friend in this world, and I don't either. It seems like we kind of have a lot in common. We probably ought to be friends. And he said, I'm for it. He was a Jewish fellow. I was such an ignorant person that over the course of 10 years, my witness to Mike, Mike was impressed with me and not with Christ. At the end of 10 years, I put Mike had been a heroin addict for 10 years and in methadone treatment for 10 years. And he weighed about 400 pounds, and I put him in a place in Chicago to get him off the drugs. And he got out, and I gave him a sponsor at the church we were at to watch over him. And Mike called me in 1987 one night about midnight and said, could you come over and talk to me? And I said, okay. So I went over to a place called Curly's Lounge, and Mike was in there with the other guy, and he said to me, the guy's in the bathroom snorting cocaine that you gave me to sponsor me. And I just thought, that's probably bad. I said, yeah. The guy was an elder in the church, of course. And so Mike said to me, you know, I no offense, but I love you. And he wasn't a guy who liked people. And he was hard to like. But he said, do I need this Jesus? And I said, you do. And Mike said, well, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. His arm started bleeding. He had all these old needle mark things. And he said, let's go get something to eat and I'll change. I said, no, I have to go home. I have to get up in the morning. And by then I was working. And he said, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to come by and I'll either decide to follow Christ, and you tell me and I'll do whatever you say, Billy, or I don't want to hear about it again. And I thought that was okay. I thought heaven was probably glad to hear that. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. I took a left at the first curve, and Mike had a Z, whatever it is, and he went over the railroad tracks and went that way. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang, and his cousin called me and said, Mike's dead. And I said, what? And he said he got high last night and crashed this car and broke his neck. And I said, what? And I said, what time? He said, 2:05 in the morning. I said, he wasn't high. And I said, he was with me. And he went right, and within 150 feet of where I left him, he was dead. Had a heart attack. I guess 10 o'clock tomorrow morning wasn't going to be in Mike's life. Now, I tell you that because I love Mike. And my decisionalism pains me that I would explain the gospel to Mike, one guy I cared about, so poorly. Now, you're going to think I'm crazy, but because I told you I'd tell you how I think about these things, some nights I hear Mike. Understand? I try to remember to hear him. Why? I love Mike. Mike's gone. My son's not. The girl at the restaurant's not. I want that on my mind when I see that girl at the restaurant, that in a moment, all of her chains will be like Mike's, complete darkness, where it'll say forevermore. She doesn't know it and doesn't care about her own soul. So what? I should. Now, you'll see all of these things are personal. Why shouldn't they be? Aren't they all, Andy? Isn't all theology personal? You have a philosophy towards life. I have one. So does she, that girl I'm going to see tonight. She has a philosophy. A great Greek guy said, look, all history is just philosophy set out by example. Isn't it? I was giving Mike my understanding of life. And I was happy about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It never occurred to me God could demand tonight. God was offended that Mike and I would treat something as precious as his soul with such sort of mechanical thing to it. So you'll see that all those things are important to me. Mike had a theology. I had one. Mine was bad. I hope it's better now. But I want you to know I think about those things. It's the same way sometimes when I get too prosperous. I try to see these people as skeletons. Now why? I'm a visual person. Arnett is kind of like this. If I go over there, if I see that pretty girl, I'll think she has the world, but she doesn't. She's lost. It's a disadvantage to be pretty, for goodness sake. It always is a setback, isn't it? If you're pretty and smart and successful on top of it, it's like no chance for you in this world. You know, you'd be better off to be real homely. You have some time to think about things, and maybe people abuse you a little bit and get you to, you know, to really bearing down on the important things in life because you get some pain in this world. But I have to see them as skeletons. That's why that Doré picture sticks in my mind that I showed you at the beginning. I want to remember, how far away is that girl tonight from being a skeleton? Do you think she'll be pretty then? You see, but I'm so cold I forget it if I don't utilize those kind of things. I used this E.A. Robinson. You'll see that I think he's about the smartest guy who was a non-Christian you ever saw. He was a poet from the 20s. And he says all sorts of marvelous things. He said this: the world is kind of a spiritual kindergarten where millions of infants are trying to spell God with all the wrong blocks. Isn't that true? Now, why would I use a guy who's not a Christian? Most of the guys that you talk to in a pub or some other thing outside of Sunday school, do you know what happens? They don't want the Apostle Paul talking to them. Have you noticed that? So I'll say something like, you know, all flesh is grass and all the glory of man is the flower of the grass. Henry David Thoreau said that. Oh, you folks know. Somebody else said it before Thoreau. See, but once they think it's brilliant, I tell them, well, he only got it from Peter. Not like he made it up. You know what I mean? So you have to do that. Instead of saying Proverbs, where I'll say, you know, as man thinketh in his heart, so is he. If that person is mad at God, I will learn to say things like what E.A. Robinson said, who they all like. They don't know him. They don't have a grudge against him. It's the Apostle Paul they hate. And nobody likes the Apostle Paul. So you say to him, well, we die of what we eat and drink, but more we die of what we think. You think that's true? See, if you ask a guy that question, aren't you really saying to him, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he? If I'm in Sunday school, I would use that proverb. If I'm in the pub, I want to say something where they don't get put off by it. Because I don't care if they think I'm smart. I want God. I want to drive home and say, Lord, are you pleased? If nobody in the universe knows that I've ever done one thing, I want the Lord to do it. Isn't that what we live for? Isn't it that personal? Or do you have to have a certain amount of success in some earthly term? If you do, you're making a mistake. Your whole purpose in being alive might be so you can come, if you're Jeff, so that I can say one sentence to Jeff. That would be just fine with me. I'm telling you, I'll take Josh or Jeff if the Lord just lets me say one thing. Now, I say that because when you get down to that last chorus, the sounds of chains racks my brains. Man's freedom is captivity. Slaves that fall in love with captors have lost the desire to be free. Whether it's a good lyric or a bad lyric, the truth of the matter is they don't have any desire to be free, do they, Marie? You didn't either. You were completely in darkness and didn't even know it and didn't want to be removed from it. and God came along and didn't ask. One of the things you'll always find that pastors say to you, Free Will Baptists, I told Matt, if you could just round one up, I could have them in here, it'd be easier. But if you get them, they'll say, God's a gentleman, he'll never interfere without my... Well, I hope he can. If he didn't, you'd be in trouble. Oh, my goodness gracious, I'm going to paint you a picture with that T that'll let you know if he didn't, you'd be done. You don't have anything to brag about. You don't even have the ability to think. If I'm right, on 1 Corinthians 4, it says, Paul argues, what do you have that wasn't given you? Seems like we'd have boasting excluded. Seems like there'd be no humbler group than a Reformed group. C.S. Lewis once said, when humility enters the room, modesty leaves. Isn't that the way it should be for us? We should be the most humble. The most, I guess, when you see these things, we should be the most, what I would call fiery people. Not in the sense of being fiery loud, but being on fire. Why? We're trying to educate, not only here today. In Sunday school, most of you are going to have Bible studies. And if you remember and that's why I put him in here, W.B. Yeats, who is a lot of Irishmen get into these things when I'm doing it. What will happen is he said something I never forget. He said, look, education isn't the filling of a bucket, it's the lighting of a fire. That's why, Jeff, when I see you, like that first time, I thought, you seem to have that thing where that's really on your heart, that it isn't just to educate me, but to set me on fire with it, so that it makes a difference in my life. Isn't that, do you want a Bible study that's just about learning things? I'm telling you, I'm too old to do that. Now, the world is full of Jephthahs. I'm going to tell you Jephthah, he's Judges 11. If you know Jephthah, great. Let me tell you why Jephthah is important to me, why he might be important to you. Jephthah is a perfect example of a man who suffered and was a loser. If you read Judges 11, you'll find out Jephthah has a father named Gilead. He has brothers. Gilead is a famous man, isn't he, in Israel? But he has an affair with a harlot. This boy is the harlot's boy, our man Jephthah. So because cruelty doesn't keep you in the dark very long, his brothers let him know that he's not one of them early on. And the scripture says that he went to the land of Tob to lead a band of worthless men. When you meet people in the world who have lost, maybe the woman at the well, right? Maybe somebody who's a loser like that woman, or the Zacchaeuses, whoever it is in your world that you run into, Jephthah is a ray of hope to me. Why? You ask Jephthah at age 10 what he thinks about God and his life, and what's he going to say to you? God has forsaken me. God has abandoned me. Is it true? No. Why is he suffering? Why is he in the land of Tob? I see in a few years Israel's going to need a deliverer, and he's going to be the man for the job. Why? His brothers were raised by the swimming pool. His brothers are not useful to lead the army. One man is. The guy who slept out on the ground, the guy who thought he was abandoned, God was training him the whole time for service. But I asked Jephthah, do you think time and distance are a hindrance to travel? If you do, I'm going to tell you they're not. I sit down with Jephthah and I say to him, what do you think about God? You're 12 now. And I try to imagine what it is to be in the land of Tob, away from everybody. He started his life in disgrace. What did he have to do with that, do you suppose? Nothing. Should he have been run out? Why, the nerve of those brothers. Do you think this was the only thing, the only affair Gilead had? You just have to read a little bit. But he suffered. Do you think God told him when he was 12? No. I go back on his 13th birthday, ask him again. He doesn't know. I know he's being trained. I watch him. Finally, one day comes, and he gets it. Oh, I see, that's Joseph's story, isn't it? I see, how long did Joseph wait to find out that God was training him? See, what about David? What about Moses? What about you? Why is it that it's always about somebody else and not you? Why can't it be you? Why can't tomorrow be the day you've lived for? My wife said to me the first time we pulled up here, I said, oh, I don't know if I belong here. Charles told me these people are pretty well educated, I said, I don't know what good I could do. And she said to me, maybe you're going to meet the most important person you ever met in this church. Maybe I'm going to meet, now would you like to have a wife like that? Maybe you're going to meet them. Andy, is that possible? What if you're that guy for me? What if you're crucial to my life? Well, I hope you've been praying. I hope you've been studying. You see, when you see each other on Sunday morning, instead of always saying, isn't it good that we're one big happy family, which I'm happy about, but you need to look in those eyes and say, what if this is that person? Because life works that way, doesn't it? One day those elders showed up and Jephthah said, aren't you the guys who threw me out? I'm trying to remember. Aren't you? But now we're seeing Joseph, aren't we? And what does Joseph say famously? I see God sent me here. Well, why is it that's true in the Bible and not true in your life? Except that we don't remind ourselves of it. Now, when we do it, when I say to people, this girl over here at the restaurant, when I get to know her, I'll say to her, now you're going to think I'm either the wisest person you've ever met or the craziest, because I think God's been governing your life. He brought your husband, he brought you to this point, and you know what? You might be like me. He might decide to intervene and change your heart. You might find yourself in church. It's a slippery slope, I can tell you. Once you open that Bible, God does things that you just have to be careful. I always say to people, if you don't want to be a Christian, don't open that Bible, because it's a dangerous thing. The first night I ever did it, and it's true, I had no idea. And I broke my arm, and I couldn't be repaired. And I wouldn't have thought that bothered me much, but it did. And I sat and looked at the Bible for a long period, and I knew something was dangerous about it, even though I'd mocked it. And I opened that Bible, and it was beautiful in the language. It wasn't the language of fools. There was something to it. Now, I can tell you that being Reformed, sometimes I read where God doesn't do miracles and those things. But the problem is, in my particular case, because I knew I never wanted to be a Christian, you understand? I was the most reluctant person you can imagine. If my wife would say, if there was somebody who feared being a Christian, it was me. No offense, but I always thought they issued hush puppies the minute you converted or something, you know what I mean? And I didn't want that, because I didn't want to be that guy. C.S. Lewis said, I found Christianity intriguing except for, Christianity. He meant the Christians. And I knew I'd be one of them. And I just, in this doctor's office, before I was converted, whether you believe this or not is of little consequence, it's just a fact. I had started studying the Bible, but before I was converted, because God knew I would run away from being a Christian later, I think. The doctor said to me, well, Billy, we're going downtown. Whenever anybody calls me Billy, I've known them too long. So I always wish they're dead. I've never met a guy who called me Billy I didn't wish was dead. Every time I see him, isn't that right, Lois? They'll tell some story that I wish Lois never heard. But because I was young and stupid. And this guy brought me into the world, and he was a Jewish guy who'd been through the concentration camps, and he had that tattoo on him. And he said, Billy, I'm getting ready to take you in there down to the hospital, and you'll have 60% use of your arm, and it'll be plastic and blah, blah, blah. I said to him, Doc, I've been reading the Bible. I was like, oh, he didn't want to deal with that. He was just, he was trying to be nice. And I said to him, if I go down there at 60%, what happens if I were just to jerk the thing now? And he said, well, I don't know what you're driving at. I said, well, I'm going to try to find out if God exists. And I stuck my arm out like an idiot. You notice all these stories have that same common thread. I stuck my arm out, and in a second, God healed my arm right in that doctor's office. And later on, when I heard some reform guy tell me that was impossible, I agreed with him. It just theoretically. Problem was, I was in that room. Now, I wasn't converted. Why would God do that? Because he can. Now, do I seem like the kind of guy who'd tell you this story if it wasn't true? Believe me, I have other things to do. This was true. Now, I went home. I left that doctor's office after all the doctors looked at the x-ray and said I couldn't do it, and they all swarmed around. And this poor Jewish fellow said to me, well, Bill, I don't know what to do. And I said, I think I'm going to go home and read that Bible some more. I was smart, really. Can you imagine? He said, well, I would too. So I went home, and I stayed up for a few days trying to read it, really. And one night I listened all night to a song, Come to the Water, Stand by My Side. No, you're thirsty, you won't be denied. And I didn't know the Christian way of doing things. So about 6 a.m., I played this thing over and over from midnight to 6. And at 6 a.m., I said, okay, Lord. I was afraid I'd back out. But every time that I've gotten discouraged over the years, I go back and I realize, well, it seems like I can't ignore the doctor's office. It's kind of hard to explain that away in my own mind when I'm running around. So it's kept me on track even when I've been virtually disinherited. My wife tells me it's time to wrap up. I'm sorry if I've been hard on you with this, trying to give you the background. I want you to know when we deal with sovereignty next week, if you'll read the passages, 1 Kings 22 is the passage that I will deal with primarily. It's the story of Ahab and Jehoshaphat and the random arrow. And what I'll be trying to do is to kill any idea you might ever have of fate, chance, or randomness. Okay? Because there is no chance there's such a thing as chance, and fate will become a fatality, and you're going to see that this is, otherwise you'll have to answer some questions that I can't answer about that passage. I give you Isaiah 45 for a real simple thing. It's really easy when you're dealing with people to say, this is the passage that says, the potter and the clay, but it says it in a funny way. He says, woe, W-O-E, to him who strives with his maker. I would say W-H-O-A also works. Woe, because you know what the next line says? Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. You understand? When people, a famous man once said, a man can ask more questions in an hour than a wise man can answer in a day. And sometimes you have to be able to say to people, now when you read that verse, what's potsherds referring to? Oh, I see. Me and you. If you want to argue with me, that's fine. Although Chesterton once said, the only people who really quarrel are those who don't know how to argue. And I've learned to argue a little more reasonably than when I was a young man. But I don't quarrel anymore. But I do want you to understand that God is sovereign. He's the potter. You are not. I defend his honor, but he defends his own honor, too. And you need to sometimes say to people, you're one of the potsherds. I'd be careful about striving with your maker. It's dangerous. Now, let me close with this. Okay, Lawson, I'll get them out of here. Yeah, you do. That's right. So I didn't get to the questions. The very first thing next time, I will give you the questions, and I will read you just one right now so that you understand and aren't nervous about all this. And I'd send it to Matt. Simple things. Like I said to somebody earlier tonight, Bill, I don't care what you say. I'm not as bad as you say. Don't even bother trying to convince me I am. And you have to start with the same answer I did. Remember, I'm your mom, she said to me. And I said, okay, Mom, let me explain this to you. I think you are worse than you think you are. If you read that Philip's book, you're going to see he's simple, he's plain, he's direct, and he's going to make that same statement. Yeah, you're worse than you think you are. I'm going to try to convince you folks that sovereignly God dealt with people who were a lot harder cases than you imagined yourself to be. So if you're thinking that you're still just a little bit shinier than that Mike friend of mine or the girl over there, you're not. You weren't. You didn't have one thing that God should choose you. He just did. Praise be to Lord God Almighty. Let me pray. Father, I do thank you for this chance to say these things. I would ask that you protect these people if I say something that is out of line or inaccurate. You know that I am more grateful than I let on to have this opportunity, and you know that I will do my utmost, but sir, it will always be up to you. If you could drive these things home, I would be very pleased. If you can do what I can't do. I can reason, but I can't put these things in their hearts. I barely put them in their minds. We leave these things in the hands that they belong in your hands, because you are sovereign. Help these people to have patience with me to get through this thing. Sir, I will do my best, and I want this to be life-changing for me and perhaps for some of them. I ask all of this in the name of him who's soon to gather us all home, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.